Reaching the spot where the deer was hit, he followed the blood trail and found the broken arrow, indicating the deer couldn't have gone far. The black-tailed deer finally expired in the grass. At that moment, Clay's anxiety was relieved, and he couldn't help but shout with joy. The deer weighed about 60 kilograms. With numerous grizzly bears in the forest, Clay wasted no time and began to butcher the deer, carrying several legs back to his shelter, which was 4 kilometers away. Fearing that grizzly bears might be attracted by the scent, he hurried back. By 5 p.m., he had brought all the deer meat back to camp. After removing the skin, bones, and offal, about 46 kilograms of pure meat remained. Keeping it in the shelter posed a risk of attracting bears, so he had to find another place to store it temporarily. Fortunately, the production team had provided each contestant with a heavy rope specifically for hanging meat. Clay hung the deer meat 7 to 8 meters high, making it difficult for any bears to steal. That evening, he fried deer heart and deer fat, and the aroma gradually spread through the air, eagerly anticipating the taste. As for Colt, he had also hoped to rely on hunting deer for food storage, but he hadn't seen even a trace of deer so far. He had no choice but to gather wild onions and berries. Thankfully, the low temperatures in the area meant that the berries could stay fresh in a cave for 3 weeks without spoiling. Taking advantage of their availability, Colt spent time each day gathering them to prepare for the winter. When talking about the $500,000 prize, he envisioned using the money to build a community farm to give more people a chance to experience the wilderness. However, unexpected events occur quickly. The next day, as he went to have some berries for breakfast, he discovered a bear had raided his storage overnight, eating half of the berries. Due to local legal restrictions, fishing nets could only be used after surviving for 45 days. Naturally, Colt also thought of making a large fish basket using fir branches. After completing the basket, over a meter tall, it was the only one that seemed hopeful among the contestants' creations, as others were either too small or too crudely made. Rowing to the middle of the lake, Colt wasn't sure how deep the water was. He placed the basket, marking the spot with driftwood. Logically, there should be a good chance of catching fish. Nate has lost 32 kilograms from hunger, his cheekbones now prominently visible. Each day, he looks forward to checking his fishing line at the dock, his mood lifting with excitement. He slowly drags a fish towards the shore, but just as he is about to secure it, the fish slips off the hook. Nate quickly rushes into the water to catch it, but sadly watches as the fish escapes back into the lake. Without fish, he continues to drink pine needle tea. Having learned a painful lesson, Nate decides to build a scoop net. He uses Y-shaped branches to create a circular frame and parachute cord for the netting. Although the net is a bit rough and small compared to Clay's, it should work for catching fish. When testing it, Nate finds another small fish pulling on the line, the second one he's caught. On day 23, the meat Clay hung in the tree remains untouched by grizzly bears. Clay plans to build a smokehouse to preserve the meat through dehydration for a longer period. The structure must be robust to keep out grizzly bears. He uses a simple mortise and tenon structure, stacking cut logs into a square shape, binding wire inside for hanging the meat, and plugging gaps in the walls with moss. The roof is also covered with a thick layer of moss for waterproofing. He patiently slices the deer meat into strips, hanging over 46 kilograms of it in the smokehouse. By waiting overnight, the meat can be preserved for several months. Clay is now firmly leading in resource management. Teresa has finally completed her pit house but must still test its smoke ventilation. The results are disappointing. Within half an hour, the smoke makes it impossible for her to keep her eyes open. She gathers a large number of stones from nearby to build a meat smoker over the fire pit, filling the gaps with mud. The height is level with the ground, facilitating cover. The improved fire quickly shows effects, allowing her to move from her tent to the pit house. The pit house's insulation far surpasses other contestants' wooden houses, allowing Teresa to conserve energy by sleeping in just a sleeping bag. Turning back to Nate, he forgot to cover his iron pot before going to sleep 2 days ago. Drinking water in the dim morning light, he didn't notice several squirrel droppings in the water until daylight. He's unsure if this will cause illness but feels fine so far. Today, he plans to make a fishing rod with a reel for longer casts, taking advantage of the dock's extension to catch bigger fish. After completing the rod and reel, Nate starts feeling nauseous and cold at 4 p.m. He suspects an infection from salmonella carried in the squirrel feces, as nausea and chills are typical symptoms. Regretfully, He makes the call to withdraw from the competition. Billy hasn't eaten any meat since the challenge began. He has lost 45 pounds. His fishing trap in the lake has been set for a week, hoping to catch a few fish to satisfy his craving for meat. Unfortunately, each time he checks, the trap is empty. With no other option, he tries fishing again. After nearly 2 hours by the lake, he finally catches a rainbow trout weighing about 1.5 pounds. Billy quickly goes back to build up the fire and stews the trout with some wild vegetables. While waiting for the fish to cook, he keeps an eye out for grizzly bears, fearing they might appear from nowhere and steal his catch. Eating just the fish meat is no longer enough to satisfy his protein needs, so he consumes the bones as well to feel fully satisfied. As the weather gets colder each day, it's necessary for Ross to install a large door on her squash shack to block the wind. Otherwise, the cold north wind at night is too much for her to withstand. On day 8, she found some wooden planks with nails still in them, which she hadn't used. Ross pulled the nails out, made a tripod from sticks, and wove some pine branches on top. By day 26, only 5 contestants remain. Billy, who had finally caught a rainbow trout, now only has a few sips of soup left, but they still taste incredibly delicious to him, as this was the first meat he's eaten since the challenge began. Feeling the cold weather, he plans to make a wooden door, using the classic design of 5 logs with 2 horizontal supports, and stuffs it with pine resin to enhance the wind-blocking effect. He uses a wire to tie to the house, avoiding even the effort of saying "open sesame" by just stepping on it. After fixing the door, he must also sort out the fireplace so he won't have to go outside to start a fire or boil water when it's windy or rainy. The stones are piled up on the lakeshore, and moving them to the shelter requires going up a steep slope. For an ordinary person, it's a simple task, but for Billy, who has been starving for months, it's a strenuous activity. Billy uses clay instead of cement to build a semicircular fireplace with stacked stones. It doesn't take much time, and the smoke ventilation works quite well. Ross sits inside her squash shack, using a found glass bottle as a hand warmer. The low energy intake makes her always feel cold, so she relies on this simple method to warm her hands, occasionally adding rose hips to the bottle for a unique flavor and a significant boost in vitamin C. Her luck with fishing has been poor, and now she thinks about setting traps in the woods to catch rabbits, a method she hasn't tried yet. Although squirrels are protected by local laws and cannot be trapped, making the wire loop larger should prevent harming them. Still, it carries some risks, which might be why the contestants are hesitant to set traps. Ross has no choice but to take this path now, with her mind focused solely on getting food to keep going. Fortunately, while setting traps, her sharp eyes spot a bear trap among some dry leaves. Since 2017, trapping bears has been banned for non-indigenous people, and given its rusty condition, it's definitely several years old. 2 days after setting up the traps, Ross found bear tracks on the ground while checking them. The tracks were near the lake, not far from where she was staying. As she was about to leave, Ross saw the bear that made the tracks coming towards her, which frightened her immensely. Ross hadn't recovered from the scare when she questioned whether risking her life for $500,000 was worth it. She held the emergency communicator in her hand, ready to press the button to quit. However, after calming down, she decided to continue the challenge. She caught an unlucky smoke-colored jackrabbit, the first rabbit caught this season. Ross had never had a full stomach, so she quickly cleaned the rabbit and set up a pot over a fire outside the camp. She exclaimed, "Oh my God," smelling the delicious aroma. After cooking, she ate the rabbit heart first, savoring its protein content, which was much higher than beef, chewing slowly before swallowing. Clay wanted to use the deer hide to make a lure hat to get closer to other animals for more hunting opportunities, also as a way to respect the hunted black-tailed deer by using every part of it. After removing the deer hide, he scraped off the fat, meat scraps, and cartilage to prevent rot. He then stitched the eyes and mouth, filling them with moss to create the lure hat. Clay scooped out the deer brains, mashed them into a paste in an iron pot, and spread it over the hide. The brain paste contained lecithin, a natural agent used for making leather. Colt, unable to get meat, decided to go after morels, abundant in his area. He collected 13 kilograms of morels and hung them to dry inside his cabin, hoping they would last until day 45 when he planned to catch big fish using a fish net and a tarp boat. A sudden heavy snowfall prevented Colt from collecting more morels. He then worked on improving his shelter to withstand the cold weather covering the roof and walls with pine branches. Teresa followed a similar path, relying on edible plants for survival, because she believed the caloric content of plants was underestimated. She had tried fishing several times without success, or only catching month-old fry. She focused on collecting plants, targeting bright red bearberries and Solomon's seal roots in the fields. However, engrossed in her work, Teresa realized she had lost her way, which filled her with an unstoppable fear. Teresa tearfully told the camera she was ready to quit. Her feet frantically searched for a way out. Seeing more trees blown down by the wind, she knew she was getting closer to the lake. Once she found her way back to the shelter, she stopped talking about quitting. Her outing yielded 3 cans of cranberries, a bag of rose hips, a bag of wild vegetables, and some Solomon seal roots, barely enough to sustain her for the day. To conserve her fat reserves, she depended on fish from the lake. Teresa built a small raft from logs, tying a trawling rope at the bottom, ready to pull the raft into deeper waters with a trawling system. Setting up for the first time required her to brave the cold water, wearing a life jacket and carrying an emergency communicator. After stretching her limbs, she swam into the deeper water. Unexpected inflation of the life jacket disrupted her rhythm, tangling the trawling rope around her clothing, complicating what should have been a quick task. Her legs, freezing and reddened, neared hypothermia. After returning to shore, she stayed by the fire for a long time. Although she recovered by nightfall, her legs were burned from being too close to the fire. Colt, on his 10th check of his hand-woven fish traps, had yet to catch anything. He stayed to fish, and his luck turned, catching 2 small fish, each only about half a pound. If only they were bigger, he could have had a hearty meal. Clay heard noises outside his camp in the middle of the night. Wearing a headlamp, he saw nothing. The sounds disappeared. By dawn, he realized a gray bear had approached within meters of his food storage. Worried about his dried deer meat being stolen, he planned to set up an alarm system. He tied a bear whistle to a tree, surrounding the storage with a string that would trigger the whistle if a bear stumbled upon it, scaring off even a tiger. With limited smoked deer meat, he could only eat a little over 2 ounces a day, or it would be gone in less than a half-month. Relying solely on deer meat was not enough for victory. Like the others, Clay needed fish from the lake to maintain his weight, but he too had no luck catching any. On day 32, Billy woke up early to find several holes chewed in his clothes by mice. It had been over 10 days since he last ate meat, and he was in urgent need of protein and fats. The ground, covered in snow, was very slippery. Despite walking cautiously, he still slipped and twisted his ankle, which was already injured. Billy went to the lake to calm his mind and fish, but after 5 hours, he caught nothing. Even with a strong mindset, this situation could be disheartening. Teresa's knees were blistered from burns. The painful price paid was compounded by her trawling rope tangling into a mess, rendering it useless. Unable to contain her frustration any longer, she crouched by the lake and cried for a few minutes. Colt, too, was having a rough day. He went to check his fish traps, only to find them stuck under debris in the water. After several attempts to free them failed, he cut the nylon rope to minimize the loss. Ross ventured into the woods to check if her traps had caught any rabbits, hoping rabbit meat would sustain her. However, she was unsettled to find cougar tracks in the snow following her own. She worried that even if the traps caught rabbits, the cougar could be a threat. Indeed, the cougar hadn't taken any rabbits, but it had tampered with the traps, making successful hunting even more challenging. Ross felt her toes throbbing with pain. Back at the shelter, she removed her shoes and socks and discovered frostbite symptoms, meaning she had to warm her toes every hour, severely limiting her time outside and work efficiency. Clay finally finished making deer leather, which he used to craft a lounge chair. He accidentally spotted a gray bear near the lake while setting it up. Not wanting it around the camp, he followed its tracks to understand its movements. Suddenly, he was frightened as the bear emerged just 7 to 8 meters behind a tree and charged at him. Clay quickly used bear spray, averting a dangerous situation. By day 36, Teresa cleaned her camera lens early in the morning, clearing the previously hazy image. She left her hut to forage, not wanting to be a vegetarian in the wilderness. Despite her lack of success in fishing and hunting, she had been surviving on plants. Unexpectedly, while walking along the lakeshore, she found a small fish on the gravel, a surprising source of protein, likely dropped by an eagle. Her luck continued as she spotted another fish in the water, weighing about 3 pounds and fresh enough to eat. If the other contestants knew, they would surely be envious of her incredible find just steps from her door. Teresa was already very weak. The 2 fish were crucial for her. Although the boiled fish tasted unpleasant, she forced herself to swallow it, hoping to sustain herself for another 10 to 15 days. Ross's situation was grim. Her frostbitten toes were constantly in pain. The rabbit she caught had only a little meat soup left, hung on a tree dozens of meters from the camp. She wanted to retrieve it for breakfast, but her weak body made walking feel as strenuous as running a marathon. Gradually, she couldn't even hold the camera steady. Her vision blurred, and her hearing seemed to decline. Ross quickly called the medical team to examine her. After describing her symptoms and being checked by the medical staff, she had to evacuate immediately to avoid severe health risks. Her endurance was well known. Surviving over 30 days with just 1 snowshoe hare was already her limit. She was carried onto the boat when she left, leaving only 4 contestants in the challenge. Facing a temperature of -12 degrees, Billy lived in a drafty wooden cabin which was very tough. He collected moss from outside to fill every crack between the logs and made a fire in the fireplace to slightly warm the interior. Gillnets could not be used before day 45, and he couldn't wait to finish weaving it, placing all his hopes on it. He also made a soup spoon, fantasizing about how great it would be to sit in the cabin, eating fish and drinking soup heartily. To pass time faster, Billy made a bear spear, cutting off his belt and sewing it into a sheath for the knife. The craftsmanship was quite good. Colt didn't see any animal tracks in the snow and decided to go fishing. Unlike Teresa's luck, he found a dead bird floating in the lake, which didn't smell bad. He plucked it on the spot, planning to take it back to the shelter to eat. Since the start of the challenge, he had lost 60 pounds. Without eating some meat soon, he risked being forced to leave the show by the production team. Eating the dead bird carried the risk of infection from parasites, but Colt only ate it after making sure it was thoroughly cooked, not stopping until he had finished everything. Teresa wore a homemade parka, specially prepared to handle the cold weather for her wilderness solitude. Wearing new clothes greatly improved her mood. Today's task was to collect rose hips. Thanks to the late drop of rose hips and bearberries, they became Teresa's life-saving food here. She filled the cloth bag she brought in half an hour. Previously, while cleaning fish guts on the lakeshore, she noticed many small fish coming to eat. She thought of making a fish basket. Since she couldn't catch big fish, catching several small ones would also do. After completing the task, she planned to place the fish basket in deeper water. Teresa had already set up anchors in the water. Now, she just needed to pull the rope to drag the fish basket into the deeper water. However, things didn't go smoothly. The fish basket got stuck halfway and wouldn't move. She had to use her long legs to walk into the lake and properly set up the fish basket. I seriously suspect she did it on purpose. By day 44, Colt also started weaving a gill net, striving to get every knot and float right. He worked from morning till nightfall to finish the gill net on time. Unexpectedly, at 2:30 a.m., a fierce wind blew, giving him a bad feeling. Worried that his tarp boat might be damaged, he went to the lakeside with a headlamp to check. Sure enough, 2 rope knots had loosened on the boat. It was fortunate that he checked. Otherwise, just when he could use the gill net, the boat might have sunk the night before. That would have been infuriating. The next day, Billy sawed down a slender pine tree, removed all its branches to use as a long pole for binding the gill net, and chose a suitable spot to lower the net. He secured the long pole with stones to prevent it from being washed away. He hoped the gill net would turn his fortunes around. Otherwise, he would have to rely on his body's fat reserves to endure, just like a bear. Colt wasn't in a hurry to get into the water, but decided to add a few more beams to the boat and replace 2 crossbeams to increase buoyancy and stability. Afterwards, he sailed out and spread the gill net in the deep water, greatly increasing his chances of catching fish. While everyone else was busy setting nets to catch fish, Clay had the leisure to stuff moss into nets as sword targets and occasionally practice archery outside the camp. Today, he also needed to set up his gill net. For this, he decided to make a trawling pulley system. By standing on shore, he could easily deploy and retrieve the gill net. He constructed a tripod from logs, fixed an iron ring at the top, connected another iron ring to a buoy attached to an anchor stone in the water, and linked the 2 rings with a nylon rope. The gill net was thus freely deployed and retrieved. During his busy work, he noticed a teal duck less than 10 meters away. Seizing this rare opportunity, Clay immediately stopped his work and shot an arrow at the duck. Unfortunately, the wave pushed the arrow just under the duck's belly, and he missed the chance for a follow-up shot. It was an exciting time for checking. Teresa's highly anticipated fish basket had been washed ashore by the large waves, which were more destructive than she expected. With no fish to eat, and only some matsutake mushrooms she had picked, she decided to cut them into pieces and boil them. Billy's gill net had not been washed ashore, but there was no need to retrieve it because from the shore, he could see it was empty. Now, all his hopes were dashed. Facing continuous attempts and failures, his mood sank to an all-time low. He wished his father was there to encourage him, but his determination to persevere remained unshaken. Clay's gill net also yielded nothing and got tangled by the waves. If he continued to catch nothing, winning seemed unlikely. However, his gill net finally caught 2 rainbow trout, giving the contestants a much-needed boost. Despite losing 60 pounds over these days, with fish from the lake as food, he confidently said he could last another 50 days. Clay ventured into the forest to search for matsutake mushrooms. The area was scarce in grouse and rabbits, but fortunately, mushrooms were plentiful. While I marveled at his cutting technique, Clay pulled out a bag full of matsutake mushrooms. He had gathered 2 kilograms just along this ridge. Before the competition, Billy weighed 270 pounds and had plenty of body fat left, despite being hungry. He figured he could last another 20 days on tough resolve. Unable to find meat, he turned to wild onions, which were abundant near the camp. As long as they weren't withered, he could dig them up daily. Billy even started planting the onions he couldn't finish eating to keep them fresh. But realistically, it seemed unlikely there would be any leftovers. The gill nets remained persistently empty. Due to the lack of food, the cold became increasingly unbearable, causing his limbs to feel abnormally cold. Billy stretched his feet towards the fire to warm up, but accidentally burned a large hole in his socks. The contestants' luck seemed worse than ever. Teresa returned to her days of collecting berries for food. She hadn't found any fish by the lake again, and even picking berries left her gasping for breath, clearly due to long-term food shortage. It seemed she might be evacuated like Ross had been. Currently, Colt faced the least stress. Having great success in fishing, he had made some dice in the melon shed today for entertainment and relaxation. However, when it was time to check the nets, he was stunned upon reaching the lake. His trusted tarp boat had sunk. Colt insisted on rescuing it. He pulled the boat ashore and after inspecting it, discovered that only the waves had swept water into the cabin, causing it to sink. The boat's ribs and a few seat planks were dispersed, but it could still be used as before once repaired. Clay has lost 20% of his body weight so far, but he still has muscle. There's not much meat left on the black-tailed deer. He desperately needs fish from the lake to supplement his diet. This time, his gill net finally met expectations, catching a rainbow trout frozen in an arc shape, which could provide about 2,500 calories. However, the waves tangled the gill net again. He decided to relocate the net near a large boulder, cut a log from the forest, and use it as a ladder on the boulder. Clay climbed up, threw the anchor stone connected to the float into the lake, moved the tripod over, assembled the trawling system, and secured the gill net in place. On day 58, Colt got a foreign object in his eye, making it difficult to even open his eyes. Despite this, he couldn't let it affect the competition, especially as he was close to winning. He used a syringe from the provided medical kit to flush out the foreign object. Then, he rowed his tarp boat to check the gill net. At this exciting moment, the gill net caught another bull for him. With this momentum, Colt could easily last 100 days. Back at the shelter, Colt arranged the iron pot for stew, enjoying fish soup and fish meat, with the situation looking very promising. After eating well, Colt chopped a big pile of wood for firewood, enough for half a month. Since the gill net was so effective, he expected the days ahead to be comfortable. From morning till night, he constantly burned calories and finally set another net in the lake the next day. However, the old net caught nothing today. Was the good start over so soon? Teresa didn't want to be a vegetarian, but with limited skills in fishing and hunting, she had berries again this morning. She mashed the cooked berries, formed them into balls, and baked them on the fire, creatively turning them into a meal. While waiting, She sat by the fire doing handicrafts, planning to make a hook for hanging the iron pot. But seeing her handle the saw, I knew trouble was brewing. She wasn't skilled, and as expected, she cut her left hand. Although the medical kit had the necessary supplies, a severed tendon that couldn't heal on its own would force her to call and quit the competition. Fortunately, the wound wasn't that severe. Otherwise, quitting in such a way would be frustrating for anyone. Let's look at Clay again. Seeing the strong winds and high waves, he guessed the gill net would have no catch and decided to hunt grouse and rabbits in the forest. Instead, he found fresh cougar feces on the ground. Local laws allowed contestants to hunt cougars. With Clay's stored deer jerky running low, catching this cougar would not only provide about 10 pounds of meat, but also fulfill a long-standing wish. Unfortunately, despite searching all day, he never saw the cougar. That evening, Clay made a tube out of deer skin that emitted sounds somewhat like a deer's call, but also resembled the cry of a dying hare. The next morning before dawn, he left the shelter with his bow and arrows, planning to lure a cougar with the sounds and shoot it. Unexpectedly, the situation changed rapidly. Gray bears, absent for a long time, had returned. Clay spotted their tracks in the snow, only 7 or 8 meters from the shelter. He had no choice but to abort the hunting plan. If the deerskin tube attracted a bear instead of a cougar, it would be a double loss. Billy's gill net had never caught anything. Billy decided to move it, refusing to believe he couldn't catch a single fish. Now, climbing a steep slope left him breathless, showing his physical weakness. A few wild onions in the garden were his food for the day, enough to sustain him for another week. He had quit his job to join the contest, with barely any money left in his bank account and twins on the way. Winning the $500,000 prize was crucial to avert a financial crisis. On day 66, although Billy's gill net hadn't caught any fish, he found one on the shore, possibly stranded or dropped by a bird. It was his first meat in nearly 50 days. He cooked the fish until it was charred. After a long time on a vegetarian diet, the small amount of meat, albeit little, felt incredibly satisfying due to the protein. Colt had thought the journey ahead would be easier, but the gill net caught no more fish. He felt his weight and stamina decreasing. The next day was the medical checkup scheduled by the show's producers. All contestants feared being forced to leave due to health issues, but it was inevitable. Colt lifted his shirt to reveal his emaciated body, having lost over 30 kilograms. The other contestants were not faring much better, anxiously awaiting the medical report. Surprisingly, Colt was the contestant disqualified. Despite catching 3 large fish in the past 20 days, his significant weight loss beforehand was too great. The doctor said his cardiovascular system was under immense stress, and staying could cause permanent damage. Facing permanent injury meant automatic disqualification. If Lake Chilkoot in Season 7 had the same fish resources as Big Slave Lake, Colt might not have been disqualified and could have been a strong contender for the champion. Clay had finally finished his deer meat and was now also facing a food crisis. He had moved the gill net to a new location a few days earlier, but it was empty and tangled when he checked it this morning. Clay could no longer tolerate the device. Even after placing it deep in the water, he decided not to waste more time on it. Teresa was semi-giving up, lacking hunting skills and unwilling to hunt. This morning, she made a broom in the pit house. Her craftsmanship was impressive. She took the broom outside, intending to clear the snow off the roof, but being on a vegetarian diet, she quickly felt dizzy and had to lie down again. Without wood for the fire due to not collecting it the day before, she forced herself to gather wood outside. Walking on land, she felt as if moving through water. While collecting wood, she saw deer tracks in the snow, the first since the challenge began. But she was indifferent, either too weak to care or unwilling to change her situation. Teresa had settled on berries and mushrooms. On day 69, she received a text from the show saying her medical checkup was moved up and to stay at the camp. She fantasized about being the last one standing and that the crew would soon announce her victory, but reality was harsh. Teresa had become extremely thin, and the early medical checkup was due to poor last results. Her heart rate had increased by 20% over the last week, a possible sign of impending heart failure, making her the 3rd contestant to be forced to leave. Now only Billy, the endurance king, and Clay, the deer hunting expert, remained. Billy's gill net was predictably empty. Desperate, he decided to eat pine bark. After peeling off the outer bark, he collected the inner layer, containing digestible sugars, fiber, and starch. He boiled the bark in a pot. The red color looked tasty, but it was hard to swallow. Drinking more made him feel nauseous. Not wanting to lose the little food in his stomach, he decisively covered the pot and planned to look for other food. Clay had given up on fishing and decided to focus on traps and hunting. He had set several traps for squirrels in the forest. The first trap had been touched, as there were many rabbit tracks around. As expected, the second trap caught one. He thought that would be all for the day. But 3 wire snares caught 2 snowshoe hares, boosting Clay's confidence as his food supply dwindled. The savory stewed rabbit meat satisfied his hunger. Every bite was precious, and he couldn't bear to waste any, bones included, wanting to consume more calories. That night, a noise outside from a fallen net woke him. Clay thought a gray bear had knocked it over. Opening the door and shining a flashlight, he found a fisher, a fierce animal with no natural predators and protected by local laws, hence he couldn't hunt it. Otherwise, Clay would have shot it with an arrow right then. Billy was devastated by a few sips of pine bark soup. He felt extremely nauseous yesterday and still hasn't recovered, lying in bed as if waiting for death. He must go out to find food to fill his stomach. While searching nearby, he discovered a large patch of wild onions, ensuring he wouldn't worry about food for the next few days. Since the start of the challenge, Billy has been eating wild onions, frying some and boiling others. After eating them for over 2 months, he still praises their taste. I truly admire his perseverance. Clay's situation isn't promising either. Today, while checking his traps, he saw fisher tracks in the snow following his own footprints. It seems the fisher had checked the traps before him. Clay felt a sense of doom when he found blood near the traps, likely left when the fisher stole a rabbit. If the fisher keeps visiting each night, Clay figures he won't last much longer in the competition. Every time Billy returns from fetching water from the lake, he has to climb a steep slope, walking about 100 meters. Today, he felt his heartbeat accelerate for the first time, pounding intensely. He suspects he might have heart palpitations and feels dizzy as if he's falling apart. Billy continuously apologizes to his wife, admitting he might not last much longer. Clay is also reaching the end of his resources. On day 71, Thanksgiving Day, he took out the family photo he had brought, but resisted looking at until now. Overwhelmed with longing for his family, he shed tears he hadn't shed in decades and prepared himself to go home to see them. On day 73, the crew's yacht appeared on camera, indicating someone had called to quit. The question was, who could it be? The answer was, Endurance King Billy. Over the past few days, he had felt his heartbeat increasing and his breathing becoming labored. Although he could continue to endure hunger and isolation, losing 90 pounds was the limit for his body. Any further weight loss could be dangerous, so Billy had no choice but to withdraw from the challenge. On day 74, Clay became the champion of Season 8 of the Wilderness Survival Challenge, winning the prize money.